Welcome to Ready for Mistakes. I'm your host, Jeff Smoody. This show is about conversations with photographers and photo-adjacent artists on their practices, their projects, all that jazz. Hope you guys got a chance to listen to the previous conversation with Caitlin M. Rogers. It was really great to get to know her and her work a bit more. Her work is really fantastic, so really take a good moment to go back, listen to the show with her, and take a look at her work and all that. Today's conversation is with another member of Disparate Projects. If you remember from the second episode of this season with Micah McCoy, who's also a member of Disparate Projects. Today's guest, Vann Thomas Powell, is one of the three. Today we'll be talking with him about his work on Contentious ground, which is photographing people and places related to the American Civil War. So really quick, I'll read off a bio about Vann and his background in photography. Vann Thomas Powell, MFA at Duke University, is a documentary artist whose visual practice incorporates an array of photographic mediums in concert with historical and philosophical research to investigate how past, place, and memory construct identity, with particular focus on American identities. He's increasingly interested in investigating subjects related to foundation narratives, myths, tall tales, folklore, and seldom told histories. Vann's work has been exhibited across the United States at venues such as the International Center of Photography in New York, SlowExposures Festival in Zebulon, Georgia, Powell Gallery in Provo, Utah, City Art Space in Rochester Institute of Technology in New York, the Fredric Jameson Gallery in Durham, North Carolina. His work has appeared in domestic and international publications, including the independent Glitterati Editions. Please forgive me if I mispronounce that. Based in New York, and Subjectively Objective in Detroit, Michigan. He's self-published and published artist books in collaboration with Benschop Books in Denver, Colorado. His books and works can be found in private and public collections, including the Rubenstein Rare Books and Manuscript Gallery at Duke University, and the Museum of Fine Art Special Collections at Tufts University. Vann is also a 2023 Photolucida Critical Mass finalist. So some very cool stuff that he's got going on in there. This was a really great conversation about a subject matter that is very, very present today. I've always been so fascinated by American history in general, as well as like archaeology and all that. So just my own inherent interest in the subject matter has was really great to get to know a photo project that's about something I've always been fascinated by. Without much else to say, here is my conversation with Vann Thomas Powell. Hi, Vann. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hey, Jeff. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
In this conversation, we're going to be talking a bit about your project on Contentious ground. First, I want to ask you about your origins in photography and art as a whole.
Yeah, of course. So I was raised in a family of artists. My grandmother is a ceramicist and painter. My father was a painter as well. But art was never really laid out as like a practical path to choose from. I think my parents maybe were a little nervous of me getting involved with it and, not having a certain kind of, living or being able to make a living perhaps. So it wasn't like something that was really forced or pushed on me or really even exposed so much in terms of a viable option. But needless to say, other than that, I was still, the love of art was still established very deeply with me. Visited a lot of museums as a kid, given paints, also given disposable cameras. But, photography really came at a later date for me. It wasn't until when I was living in South Korea in, I think it was 2015, that I had a bicycle accident where in the MRI, they uncovered a tumor inside my hip. So what's called an intermedullary tumor. And, I thought, holy moly, like this is the end of my life. I've got, however many years left to live. And so I up to that point, I had been an English teacher living abroad for 6 years, and so I was like, I need to get to doing something more meaningful than what I'm doing right now. And so that's when I really picked up a camera to document, what I was doing, where I was, who I was with, to, basically try to cement some sort of meaningful experience and outlook that I was, taking part in, and trying to do. So that's kind of where it all came from.
Yeah, and then so your undergrad wasn't in photography, but your MFA was at Duke. It wasn't like explicitly photography, from what I understand, but it was like a different kind of program.
Yeah, so my undergrad was in philosophy, more particularly like continental philosophy, European philosophy. I was gonna go do, thinking about doing a PhD in that, and then I started taking the LSAT, maybe go to law school. Kind of last moment, decided not to go to law school and to move to Europe instead to teach English. That led me up to the bicycle accident, and
Yeah.
then I, getting involved with photography in the way in which I told you, I wanted to go to grad school. I started going to grad school in 21. Before that, when I moved back to the United States, I had started a freelance business doing, architectural, interior, real estate photographs, as well as corporate portraiture and things like that, to make a living. And that was fine until the pandemic.
Yeah.
So at the pandemic in 2021, just a little after it, I applied and got into Duke's MFA in experimental and documentary art. So it's traditionally the program is heavy on 16 millimeter analog filmmaking. So I call myself a filmmaker because I also make films, though that's not
Mhm.
really what I'm focusing on at the moment. So the program was actually started by a student of Walker Evans. So I like to say
Mhm.
that, like, I can trace some of my photo lineage back to him, and
Yeah.
Walker Evans is also an extremely huge, influence and inspiration to me. So very honored to be a part of that legacy. But yeah, that's where I ended up.
I always like to think about the family tree of sort of
Mm.
like photo programs. I've wanted to like try to trace mine for a while. Like I can only go as far back as like some of my teachers. But I find that so fascinating. The work that we're going to be talking about today is your project on Contentious Ground, which, going off of your website, started in 2019. Tell me a bit about this project, how it kind of came to be, what it is, and all that.
Yeah, so On Contentious Ground is a series of mostly large format, some medium format photographs looking at visitors to and sites of the Civil War, of the American Civil War. So I started that work in 2019, pre-pandemic, pre-grad school. I used that work to write about in my into my grad application at Duke, and continued working on that work primarily throughout grad school. If I wasn't doing other, projects, it was that work on Contentious Ground. So this work takes me to, sites all over the United States for the Civil War, most predominantly in the southern states where a lot of the fighting occurred. I'm out there meeting people who are visitors to these sites, whether or not they're tourists, or they're there to pay homage to a family member, an ancestor who had died on the site. Basically meeting them there, and trying to represent their story in a photograph. And kind of what I say is, in what I'm doing is I'm measuring the long shadow the Civil War is cast on today. So who are we as Americans in light of that past struggle? And so that's primarily what the work is about. And yeah, I've been working on it for about going on 7 years now.
Yeah, yeah. And since a lot of the work, or at least, a lot of the focus started off in North Carolina, where you're from, It's probably safe to assume that you growing up in North Carolina, where the Civil War was, a really common subject matter, probably played a big role in kind of developing not only who you are as a person, who you are as an artist, and how you understand it today.
Yeah, so when I was a kid, my father, who had a huge interest and love of history, used to take us to all kinds of historical sites. But the ones that left their largest and lasting impact on me were Civil War sites. I was born in 1988 and raised in the 90s, and during that period, there was a lot of national pride and a lot of feelings that we were, America was the best, and that the peak of civilization, the high 90s, very strong economy, a lot of national pride, and so and obviously that's only that those feelings and sentiments are only amplified in the mind of a 6, 7, 8 year old child. And so being on these sites and with this kind of like mindset and being inculcated in that, I couldn't quite understand like how or why we fought this war. And even though my parents would tell me about the reasons behind slavery and everything like that, and that was the cause of the war, and you're so it's such an abstract thought. You feel
Hmm.
so removed from it. And so I couldn't quite square that with my, how did we fight this war? This war was over slavery. What happened? It didn't. So I kind of like, it was unresolved in my mind. And
Hmm.
picked at it, and kind of let it alone for a while as I got older and developed new interests, and revisited it through photography later, starting in 2019.
Yeah. So, and you mentioned in your project statement that you're also like interrogating your own fascination with the Civil War historic sites, and like you were just saying, like that the youthful perspective on it is so much different from you as an adult now. So, what are some of the things that you had found now in your adult life, having made this work, that kind of contributed to that interrogation of that fascination?
When I was a child, and then throughout going into high school and everything like that, and in the South especially, some of my friends and the people in my community in school or in the neighborhood were, historically their families had been from the South, and especially like with the way slavery and the Civil War was taught in the schools there in the South when I was a kid. It wasn't taught as being the primary motive for the war, which, I mean, I think we can all, it's safe to say that the Civil War was fought over to end slavery. But that wasn't necessarily a given at the time in school. I mean, I remember the slave trade, or sorry, excuse me, the triangle trade between like, molasses, sugar, and chattel slavery between the United States, North America, Europe, and Africa being taught, and then slavery being just a minor subcontent to that lesson. So when you're in a school and slavery is a kind of subnote or footnote to the larger lesson, that kind of gives you the priorities of the institution that's teaching you. So that was kind of that kind of goes unnoticed until later on, until I'm revisiting these things in a more critical way. Not until like undergrad, and then later, when I'm making the work in the field. Some of those people, those friends of mine and the community members whose probably families would have supported or say still that it was a states' rights issue, that the war was fought over states' rights. Those are the people who, primarily I'm meeting in these sites when I'm making portraits or when I'm visiting these sites to make landscapes. And so I'm working directly with them. I'm listening to their stories, and not all of them are amongst that ilk, but I would say a large part of it is like, I don't want to give you a certain number spread, but a large portion of the people are in that camp. So I think coming at it from a place. If I was younger, I would have kind of discounted who they are. I would have labeled them as bigots, and maybe even met hate with hate myself. I think like where I'm now, and like interrogating my own role to it, and my own role to either side of the situation, is instead of discounting these people immediately, I try to take more of a empathic route and listen to them and try to understand where they're coming from, not from a point of I need to accept what they believe or endorse or condone what they believe, but as a certain kind of like understanding of who they are and what shaped their identity and how we've arisen to the point that we have arisen where we are so divided today. And that's it's not the whole reason that we are where we are today, but it is definitely a part of that conversation.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I think that this work, among some other artists that are making similar subject matter work in their own ways, is so important. Because it really is kind of one of those things, like you mentioned, like looking at how this like turning point in the United States history, the ripple effect is still felt today, and how we're looking at the way that the country is now. And thinking about like other artists like Raymond Thompson Jr.'s It's Hard to Catch Rebels Who Time Travel. Again, if I have that title slightly off, I'm at least on the right track for the title. Check out that work too, folks. It's an incredible book. Like that kind of work, whether it's explicitly related to the Civil War or more just about like the United States history with division, is so important, because I think it prods at that exact thing you mentioned about an empathetic approach to things and understanding, interrogating our own understanding of the history. And it makes me wonder a little bit about, like, something I've always wondered about is the difference in education between northern states and southern states, because like I grew up in the Midwest, and the my education mostly in Wisconsin and Illinois. There were Union states, and there were areas of the state that were part of the Underground Railroad, and Illinois has its own weird relationship with its own Union state, because if you go far enough south down to like Cairo, Illinois, and down to like Carbondale and all that, it's a very different perspective on things in the southernmost tip of the state. Also, for folks listening, yes, it is Cairo, not Cairo. The fact that these states were also part of the Underground Railroad, which, like, as a youth in the Midwest, learning about this in like junior high, this mentality that is like literally underground tunnels that freed
Right.
slaves were being guided by Harriet Tubman. But that wasn't really what happened. But going to like some of the houses in Illinois and Wisconsin that had this role to play, and then now later in life, having lived in New Bedford, which was like a really important city for the Underground Railroad, with like Frederick Douglass's role in that too. It's so fascinating to me that like the perspective of the Civil War play is such a different playbook in the North than it is in the South, from what I've heard. And I just hope that there are also primary school teachers that are doing the good work to try to educate young folks in the South about about the Civil War's actual role in things, and trying to push back against the narrative that has historically been taught in the South.
Totally. I mean, like I was illustrating about the slave trade and how it was taught in the 90s in North Carolina, the triangle trade. It really, it really matters, where where you put what importance, right? I guess, what you're highlighting. And I mean, that permeates into young brains. And so that's where we're at.
And so this work kind of starts to teeter a little bit between personal experience as well as the historic research-based work. And like, so how did you, when you were starting off, you mentioned that you were kind of going about things very much like landscape, new topographics, but about this subject matter, and started to kind of interact with other folks. How did you find that balance, and what did you learn from the people as like an artist, but also as an individual, while you started to move on from strict landscape into the more documentary approach that we have now?
Yeah, so I think I was talking about how I had found that tumor in my hip and trying to make more meaningful work or meaningful existence with my life. And when I started first doing photography, I was interested in new topographic work. I've always been interested in form, like form and formalism is very interesting to me. I like when things are, nice and neat. Not to say that I don't like messy as well, but I really like this kind of like chewy, kind of structured type of photograph is something I really appreciate. And so when I was out making photographs, when I started making photographs of the Civil War work, I was making these landscapes in a very structured, mannered way. What I began to notice was the lines in the photographs and certain subjects or content in the photographs themselves. What started appearing in my mind, and what this whole being in this space of the contentious ground and the dealing with the divisiveness. I started noticing these ruptures and these fragments and these dividing lines inside of the landscapes, and so I started naturally kind of gravitating to landscapes or points in the land that showed, this analog for this division, for this fissure in the body of American life. So that's kind of where I started going with the landscapes and what is mostly a lot represented in the body of the work currently. I started, I think, getting my start. Cutting my teeth doing corporate portraiture really helped me in the land of portraiture, because I'm not, I think like I'm relatively outgoing, but it's always, it's always a little kind of, anxiety inducing to approach someone to ask to make a portrait. It's like there's this uh, you're navigating. It's a conversation around intimacy and also rejection, where you're asking someone to be intimate with you, where they can reject you and say no, but there's something about the person that you've approached that calls to you, that maybe calls to you, intuitively, or maybe it's something, maybe there's some kind of like signifier, some kind of like message that is trying to be conveyed inside of that. And so that was always kind of a little like nerve wracking, but I kind of realized that quickly that in these spaces, we're all there for a shared love of what we're doing, of history, of uncovering, of what essentially happened in those spaces. And so in a way, that was the meat of it. That was the common thread. So just sticking to our interest in history, what happened here, telling them a little bit about what I'm doing, was really the key to opening up their interest in the subject itself and what I was doing there.
The one portrait that I kept thinking about, this one portrait that's in your website gallery. That's the family, the three folks in the family with the black dog.
Yeah.
And like I feel like that. I believe in one of the articles that you shared with me, it mentioned that the mother and father characters in this portrait were military veterans, and that the daughter was super shy, but then gave this like super intense gaze. And
Piercing.
it's an
Yeah.
incredible portrait. And
Thank
one
you.
thing I noticed after a little bit of spending time with this portrait is that both parents' eyes are also shaded,
Mm.
by his sunglasses or by her hat. And I find that this portrait is just so intense for me, even though it's a very, calm and kind portrait. And it kind of makes me think about like the interactions that you've had with others, like the portraits of the reenactors, and then the one woman with the Jesus loves you shirt, and the vest on. Thinking about it brings me into this interesting point of like who the people are that are coming to these places. Like that's one of the focuses of the project, and how different these people must think from each other, or how similar they might as well.
I'll first talk about that portrait with Rodney, Robin, and Kennedy. So the two parents who were military veterans. That was Fredericksburg, Virginia. Really beautiful day in this shade, speckled shade. That was, I was really interested. A lot of people will say, like, don't try to get people with, obfuscating their eyes in some way. And sure, I think like oftentimes it doesn't work if you're, doing it. But the fact that there's three people in that and what's making it really work, I think, is the structure, the way in which those parents are standing. Like they're saying so much about who they are and their military background through their rigid stance. But then also the daughter and her piercing gaze, and the contrast between the parents having their eyes obfuscated or shaded, and the little girl's eyes are completely bright-eyed and opened, right? Like this idea that like ideology after you've gotten to a certain age is kind of like filtered how you see things. It's kind of obfuscated your vision, but as a child you're a little bit more clear-eyed and you can see things more truly for how they actually are. So I kind of like that prescient kind of like spirit of that photograph. And when I first saw it, I was like, after I developed it, I was like, holy moly, this is really wild. But, I think to your point about like asking about who these people are, I mean, I think that's, and, how similar are they or how different are they? I think that exactly is how these portraits function, how they work. They kind of work as Rorschach tests. We put on them what we think we see. There's another photograph of a gentleman I made at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I had to actually get clearance to go onto this field because it was in the range of like artillery shells or something like that, to go see this one battlefield. And this gentleman who I made the photograph of, I believe his name was Michael. He's got a skin head. He's shaved head. He's wearing like military fatigues, and he's got this binder of the generals who had fought. I think they're mostly Confederate on this page that he's showing in the photograph, that fought at this battlefield that's on the that base area called Monroe's Crossroads. And when you're looking at it, you probably have this certain idea about like who they are and everything like that. Like maybe he's some Confederate apologist, really like heritage, not history, or sorry, history is our heritage. Hate, heritage, not hate, like this kind of like, that's maybe where you're going with it. But that gentleman's the archaeologist for the base, and he was a very open gentleman, very wonderful. I didn't get any of that. None of that was between him and I in terms of the conversation and what we talked about. Not to say that it wasn't there, but it wasn't shown. It wasn't talked about. So a lot of it is just like how you approach these photographs and who you think they are, and I think that plays into this idea of on contentious ground. There's the contention of who these people are in this ground that has been fought over, that gives rise to who we are today. But also, what's that contention between you and the person you're looking at on those spaces, right? Like that's, I think, also important.
Yeah, I don't know, that I feel like that's kind of like a holotype portrait for this project. And then the portrait of the reenactor with the Confederate uniform on.
He was he was amazing. That gentleman. So the way he's posed, it almost looks exactly like this famous photograph done by Alexander Gardner of captured Confederates at Gettysburg. And the way he's kind of just turned around to the side his profile is. And so like immediately there's this kind of sensitivity to photographic history, or even just, portraiture of that time period during the 1860s that this reenactor, immediately played into. I asked him, you look amazing. I love, your your reenactor garb and your uniform. Do you mind if I make a portrait of you? And immediately, possibly even before saying yes, just posed this.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, that's just amazing. But I guess you have to ask yourself, like, who are these people who are, posing so studied and in Confederate garb? What are they honoring, right?
Yeah.
And where do they stand on this side? There's this great book. I forget the name of the author at the moment, but it's called Confederates in the Attic, and it talks about the writer's relationship to the Civil War, and specifically to the Confederacy, and how as a boy he flirted with the Confederacy and was really interested in the Confederacy. His friends and him used to play in the woods and dress up as Confederates and everything like that. And he starts to question, like, what was he doing? And is he, eventually later on, he's thinking like, oh, I was, ignoring, like, what it really meant, And so, I think sometimes a lot of us want to, especially some people with closeness to the Civil War want to, not count themselves guilty. But, I think it's important to look at, why your interests are where they are. And, by wearing these uniforms, what are we saying about our attitudes towards those times, and are we honoring them?
Yeah, like I sometimes wonder, like, do the folks that dress in the Confederate costumes for the reenactment, do they sometimes switch over to Union just to kind of find a balance,
So I know that they actually do. I was in Gettysburg during the anniversary a few years ago, talking to some reenactors, and at risk of like completely conflicting what I just said, I mean, both things can be true, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
We can save room for complexity, and the important thing is that we can think and entertain these ideas. But the reenactor, who was in Union garb at the time, said, well, a lot of us will dress up as Confederates because it's cheaper.
Oh, yeah. Which also really plays to the historical side of things, too, because from what I understand, the Confederacy was really, really poor and had not very good stuff to fight the war against the Union soldiers, who had much better equipment and all that. If I understand the history right.
I think that's generally true. Yes, I think that's generally true.
And one thing too that I've noticed, both with some of the portraits, but also some of the just the scenes in general that you've photographed, is that there is a thread that comes up about primarily Christian symbolism. And I'm really curious what your thoughts are on that coming up periodically, like the woman's sweatshirt to the chapel.
I think that's just a reality that can't be ignored. I think it's a part of the ideological landscape just as much as it is a part of the physical landscape. And so, if I'm making honest work about the Civil War, but also, in a large part, this work is also about, the South, right? The American South. And so I think I would be remiss to not acknowledge and to, honor the truth of that landscape, because, notions of Christianity and, icons of Christianity are, pockmarked and dotted all across the South, all across the United States, but maybe even more so in intensity in the South. And so, I'm not doing it from some sort of like, it's not a missionary, experiment or like undertaking on my behalf. I'm, not a Christian myself, but I do want to honor its existence in the fact that it is there. So I'm trying to honor the truth of that.
It's just fascinating to me how it's always managed to, like, spirituality and religion in general has like found a way to weave itself into so many parts of our history, and even in contemporary days too. and it's just such a loaded topic that it can probably be saved for another day too to talk about that.
If we're being also like it being a part of the story in terms of the Civil War, it's important to show it. If we consider that at the time of the Civil War, there was a gigantic, what was called like Great Awakening happening. There were
Hmm.
these huge conversions to Christianity, like essentially like generals, especially in the southern camps, would act as these pastors as well, and sort of types of missionaries converting whole swaths of their of their soldiers. And so, I like to, in a way that's also being layered and honored there as well.
So I had another question that I think is a question that I think needs to be asked in these interviews more often,
Mm,
because I feel like it's a question that I think is most helpful to like younger artists, both by age and by experience.
hmm
Um, I'm curious about the boring side of things. Like what was the frequency of how often you went to shoot? What were you doing between photo shoots and everything? Because like what Micah and I talked about in his episode is that sometimes it feels like these projects are just this like magical object that just kind of appears every 2 to 3 years, and we the viewers don't really get to see a lot of the background and are often not talked about in interviews. So I'm curious about like what was like your life like in the time that you were making this work, between photo shoots, between studio sessions and all that.
Yeah, so it's changed a lot. This being a long form project and me liking to work at that pace, I think is a necessity in terms of it's not cheap to travel around to
Hmm.
all these different and disparate places in the United States. So I need to have the financial backing and means to be able to do that. So when I started before I was in grad school. So I wasn't able to go out as often as I did when I was in grad school. In grad school, the frequency of being able to get out into the field was a lot more than it is and has been past that time at points. I think in grad school and before grad school, even when I was doing freelance work, I was a I worked at a beer bar. I poured
Hell
beer.
yeah.
Because I used to love. I mean, I still do love drinking beer. I don't drink as much as I used to, but which is probably a
Same.
good thing. Which is probably a good thing. But yeah. So like I had different rooms, that I existed in, different avenues, different parts of my life that weren't completely dedicated to photography, but in a manner were in service of them because they allowed me to then, with the money or whatever, um, go out and make that work. So, it wasn't until after I graduated from Duke, I started teaching at NC State, and also started working as a collections photographer at the North Carolina Museum of Art when I had a lot less time because I was, putting that MFA to work, I guess.
Yeah.
And so, maybe there was a little bit more money at that point, but less time was more of the premium. But at that point, I could go a little farther to these sites. Like I was like, Ken Burns said the Civil War happened in 1,000 places, and maybe even more. So like for this work, I've traveled as far north as St. Albans, Vermont, which is pretty far north Vermont, just a little bit above Burlington, and then as far west as Glorieta Pass, New Mexico, just a little east of Santa Fe there. And so, this is the Civil War was something that happened all over the country, touched many locales of the nation at the time, and still does today. But that was something I wouldn't have been able to do if I didn't have more of a means, and
Hmm.
so. But that was also the benefit of working slowly, is
Yeah.
I didn't feel that I needed to get it all done in a year or so, I don't like that. I'm a person who's very much prone to anxiety, and self-induced anxiety. And I think if I rush myself, I'm gonna step into giving myself more of that. And I feel like, especially more so now that I understand it a little bit more. I like to lean a little bit more into, a deeper, slower method, and a method of appreciating things more. Yes, I'm trying to get something done. I'm moving towards a goal, but I want to appreciate what I'm doing as well.
For better or for worse, the pressure cooker of grad school can like you get the 2, sometimes 3 years of just like you might have an assistantship, you might have fellowship, whatever you have, you have so much time outside of, seminars and critiques to, go into the field or go in the studio or whatever. And then, like I had a bit of a culture shock after I started working full time right after grad school. I had 2 weeks of travel in Illinois. I say travel, I just went to Illinois and just like drove around rural Illinois, taking 170 photos of 6x7 film. And that was kind of like this moment of like, oh, that is like what I would love to do. Just go out and just do that for the rest of my life. But obviously, like we have all these everyday life things that we have to deal with. And of course, there's always the hope that we can become an artist where like our art becomes self-funding, and you can sell enough prints, sell enough books, and then you can just kind of go about life
Right.
without having like a 9 to 5 or a teaching gig or something. You can just kind of hang out in the studio or hang out on the road. But I think it's a super important subject for artists to talk about a bit more.
But I'd also like to kind of give you some resistance a little bit to that
Yeah,
idea, just if I can challenge you.
yeah,
I think having the freedom to be able to go out and create all the time would lose its, in my opinion, at least for me, I think, and maybe for some other folks, it would lose its you would lose its edge and its steam,
hmm
because a thing is only defined by its contrasted. It's only defined by the borders, right? So the thing that
yep,
it isn't. And so, like, if you could, I mean, at least I think I know this for myself, is that, like, if I could go out and work in the field and make photographs all the time, I think eventually I would be like, hey, I mean, like, I'm not just a photographer. I'm also a
yeah,
cyclist. I
yep,
also like to exercise. I also like to have beers with my friends, or
yeah,
whatever, and travel outside, sometimes to make photographs, but sometimes not. I think I've got my wife and everything like that I like to do things with. And so I think, like, if I just was like, no, but maybe for like a year or something, maybe if I was like, I'm gonna
yeah,
do it, you know what I'm saying? Like, but like, yeah, but I think if you just had the freedom, like, you would need, at least I would need some other outlets. Cause I think after
hmm
a while, I'd be like, I think I really do. I think after a while, I'd be like, this is a ball and chain.
I think it kind of relates to this is like one of the only times I'll like bring up gear in the show. It kind of relates to this idea of limiting the camera in a
Mm,
way that it improves your work. So like I have I use one lens per camera type. I have the 90 mil on the RB67. I have a 135 on the 4x5. I have a 45 mil on the Sony, and the point and shoot is a point and shoot. The Nikon has a 50 mil on it, and it's like I don't change lenses because they're all this one field of view, this normal field of view, and that limitation has, I think, improved my work dramatically. And I think if you were to apply that same mentality to life, having that, to your point, having that limitation of time, and also like, you got your job, you got social life, personal life, all that, those also act as a kind of constraint put on the process, just like the constraint of not using a zoom lens.
I mean, I think, like, to your point, it's always been my understanding, and it's been also drilled into me, that good art loves good constraints.
Hmm
It really gets you, very fluid and fluent with one way of looking at things, and you keep doing that and drilling into that, and you're either could be some beautiful fertile ground for some really amazing results.
Yeah, given some of the way that, that affects the way that the work is made, I'm curious about how you see this project on Contentious Ground living with the other work that you've made, both the work on your website, but also anything that you're, not showing us yet.
Yeah. So this work is it's similar to some of the other work I've made. There's two projects that it's very similar to. One being Alamance, and the other being Looking for Lowry. And so those are like unfinished projects that I don't know if I'll ever finish them or not, but maybe I will. In terms of their use of black and white, in terms of how they're looking at and talking with and interrogating history, but then I think like I use color and black and white specifically for different reasons. I think like black and white I use as like a way to talk about history and to present as a certain kind of visual language around the document, right? I think when I think about black and white, what's kind of baked into the medium of black and white photography is this kind of aboutness of, it's the voice of documentary.
Yeah.
And so, I use that to its through with its voice. A lot of my color work has been about a certain kind of it's been mostly like formal, like just about seeing and experiencing and reacting and like finding like rhythms inside of that. And so I'm thinking about my work that I made in Mexico in 2022, and in I think I was in Mexico for 2 months in 2022 over the summer, and I produced a book called Points of Entry. And so that works just about, it's basically a travel, a piece of travel log work about being in a different place, but still finding, familiarity in a certain kind of difference. And so there's that. The color work is very different from the black and white work, I think. I'm working on something now that we'll see what happens with it. I've got a few ideas, but kind of picking at that. But I'm challenging myself to see what it feels like to make something in a shorter time period, because I have the ability to, and I'm thinking, why not? And so it's a work that I've been making here in New York City that's mostly about, let's call it death and anxiety, maybe.
Yeah.
Something about that. And so, yeah, but, it's very different. I think like I might use one or two lenses at most. A lot of my work is, I think I use portraiture to talk about the environment in which we live, but also my interior spaces, especially more so in this new work. So yeah, I'm excited to share that. Excited to see where that comes out. But yeah, it's I think like I'm interested in challenging myself on different ways of seeing. I don't, there's this, I think about a lot of photographers who kind of like maybe like Todd Hido, who have like a very kind of constructed, almost like thematic photograph, and you can look at it, exactly what it is, and like, and that's across multiple bodies of work, and I think that's great and beautiful and everything like that. But it's not something I'm so much interested in. I think that makes a lot of sense for me in terms of obviously like particular bodies of work, insular bodies of work. Obviously to establish a voice and spirit and a thread. But I'm interested in challenging myself on how to see differently across multiple bodies of works.
Yeah, yeah. And also with the fact that you're kind of in this limbo between places right now, that, on Contentious Ground is like kind of reached a point, I assume, of like, you don't really have to shoot anymore for that at this point now. And that led to what you're talking about now, the ideas at play in New York, where you're in the in-between world right now.
Yeah, well, I could talk a little bit about kind of where On Contentious Ground is now and like what's going to happen with it, if that makes sense. what I've been doing, I went on a pretty large trip last summer to get some important sites that I wanted to get in Tennessee and Mississippi. And basically, what I've been doing now with the work is I've been taking it around and speaking at universities about it to classes. I've also been showing it. I've got a show coming up at the Carnegie Museum of Art and History in Jackson, Tennessee, later this summer. And I am in talks to publish a book of the work on Contentious ground with, I won't name the university at the moment, but with the university. And so that would be a book of the work divided into themes and then kind of punctuated by some critical essays about the war and about photography. So I'm very excited about that stuff. I've been working on this for 7 years. I'm excited to, not bury it, obviously. Like I hope that it continues gaining support and people want to hear me talk about it for many years to come. That would be wonderful. But I am interested in, a punctuation of sorts, right? And so I think like a nice, I think the work's a little bit academic. I think it has a lot of space in the academy. And so I want to work with an academic publisher to punctuate this period in my artistic arc, so that I can, develop some new stories in Europe.
Yeah, it does when it comes to like the structure of the rumored book. It reminds me a bit about my first photo professor's project and book, New Deal Utopias by Jason Roblando.
That sounds like a cool project.
It is very cool. And he went around to 3 different Greenbelt towns from FDR's administration.
Sure.
8x10 color film negative and photographing all these people and all that, a very similar approach. And yet another important part of American history. And I feel like a lot of these kinds of projects, they oftentimes wind up going toward this split between contemporary art and academia, which I think is really suitable for it, especially with how much photography has evolved since, like the Walker Evans that your MFA lineage goes through.
Totally. I think like my grad school is steeped in documentary art, experimental art. I'm looking forward to making a film, right? I'm looking forward to getting getting back into that world a little bit more. I think, there's the academic world and the split in what you're talking about, I think is a nice categorization of a way to kind of like chew on things and a way for us to categorize things. I think one thing that my mentor and professor at Duke University, Tom Rankin, taught me and that I've heard him speak about on multiple occasions is this idea of documentary art and being a false classification. It is fine art, right? I truly believe it is fine art. But it's just a way, what room is that conversation taking part in, right?
Yeah.
And these categories and classifications are important insofar as it helps us navigate the world and relate to other people.
Exactly, and I think that's kind of ultimately like no matter what art is, art of any type, any genre is trying to connect and communicate to some extent.
Exactly.
So we already talked a little bit about what you have, kind of in the woodwork right now before this in-between time is, up. I obviously don't want to, go into too much of that. You also have this other project that is kind of one of the main things that really introduced me to your work as a whole. Jesus Christ, Jeff. And that is your trio project, Disparate Projects, with Micah McCoy, previous guest, and Lisa Beard. We don't have to go into too deep about that because there is a really wonderful conversation that the three of you had with Michael Chauvin Dalton not too long ago, so folks can go listen to that. But I am curious about kind of if you want to talk to folks about what that is, how it came about, at least like in a kind of a brief thing as we start to kind of get toward the end of the conversation here.
I'd been speaking with Micah for a while on Instagram. He's just a amazing, friendly, magnanimous person. And so, but I met him and Lisa up in Rochester, New York in 23, I think it was 23. I believe it was 23 at the Homecoming Biennial. So that was
Mhm.
put on by, RIT and Michael Chauvin and Donna Sterling of Float Magazine, who's also, shout out Donna Sterling. She's amazing. Love her to death. So anyways, the three of us all met up there in Rochester, and we had an amazing night out. We found out that we share a lot of similar outlooks, similar sentiments about photography, also similar dispositions, personal dispositions. So I think we all kind of gel really well. And we had all finished our MFAs. I think Micah finished a year before me at Columbia College, Chicago. Lisa finished, I think, also a year before me. So that would have been 22 at Main Media MFA. And, we were all kind of like looking around and thinking, like, what's next, right? For whatever, not to talk too much about individual MFA experiences, but I think we felt like we got a lot out of our MFAs, but there was something lacking inside of
Mhm.
it. And also now that we were outside of the academy, we also were lacking a certain kind of let's call it like critical environment or environment for critical feedback. And so we all kind of, grouped together to provide this for each other, but also to make make the shows. And first we started as a curation kind of project. So to make the shows we wanted to see, to like make the conversations inside of photographs that we wanted to see, but then later on started the publishing arm of Disparate Projects, Disparate Press, to make the books that we wanted to see, and to make the designs in the books we wanted to see, and to work with artists. There's a lot of presses right now that are very rigid and very tight with exactly their aesthetic and what exactly they want to do, which is totally great, but it's not really like our mo, what we want to do. We're interested in this kind of like disparate, to use the name, approach to invite a lot of different voices, a lot of different ways of seeing. So we're not just looking at like post-documentary poetics kind of
Mhm.
representations. We are interested in that, of course, but there's a lot outside of that category that is beautiful and is amazing art these days. And so I'm not interested with this project in pigeonholing ourselves.
Yeah.
I think the field is too large for that, and there's too many great voices to only harp, or rather to only focus on one small narrative. I've always been interested in, in my philosophical studies, I've always been interested in this kind of like overarching meta narrative that's happening, and how that's a kind of conversation between all the different narratives inside of a field. And so, in some ways, maybe that's honoring that kind of ideology.
I've always enjoyed the work being published by other publishers that have like a similar kind of perspective. A lot of them are very new publishers. Because I think a lot of folks are starting to observe the exact same thing that the three of you guys did in the book world. So like I know that like Constituent is another one that
Mm,
is like pretty fresh. And then I know like Matt Ike's
the Oak.
Little Oak is the name of it. Yep, I just got the first of the little zines that he did.
Yeah, those
That's
are
such a
good.
cool
Yeah.
thing. And like the folks that are also like the bookstores that are popping up now. I'm a big supporter of Realm Photo Books in Chicago,
Oh,
which
cool.
does like
Yeah.
their pop ups right now. I hope that they'll do a brick and mortar store soon. And there's a Palm Press in up in Boston area, similar kind of thing. They have a brick and mortar, and it's like seeing these bookstores that are like becoming like photo specific and have these interesting ways of like connecting folks and all that, finding the people that have the same kinds of observations and realizing it, like I feel like through the some of the early 2000s, as we got our Alex Soths, our Christine Potters, and Justine Kurlands, all them incredible artists. I've met them,
Totally.
and they're amazing people. But it's like it feels like as younger people or younger MFA recipients observing these things and seeing our peers almost trying to follow in those footsteps, and it's like, well, how about we still have a little bit of that, but also try to break out of things a little bit more. And
Exactly.
try to find a balance between the safety of what has worked before
Yes.
and the excitement of, making someone mad, I guess.
Exactly. I don't think there's nothing wrong with that and what they're doing. I've loved those artists, and they've made amazing books and work and exhibitions that I've seen. But the thing is, like, I think what we want to avoid, in my opinion, and I think what art in general has fallen into, not just photography, but a lot of art has fallen into the trap of monoculture.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we know that, like, in terms of like studying foods and monocultured seeds and things like this, is
Yep.
like what comes out of that is like a dirge of nutrition.
Yep.
And so if we're thinking about art as a nutritious kind of engagement that gives our brains, fuel to grow and create, then what we want, a diversity of subject matter.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm interested in instantiating.
I think exactly to the analogy of food and agriculture, I suppose, is like it goes both ways of like the monoculture of like what we as people ingest, but also the farming practices that are monocrops and such, so much that also has negative effects on the soil. That analogy of like the soil being the photography world at whole, if the actual crops are in this monocrop, and then we are just consuming this monoculture of food, it does become this kind of like never-ending Ouroboros effect of like we're just kind of like regurgitating the same ideas
Exactly.
over and over again.
Exactly.
And something too with the three artists that I did mention as well, as influential as they are, they also have these bodies of work that like individual and a couple different bodies of work that just like totally deviate from what we know of. And I think of like Alex Soth's Broken Manual, I think is his magnum opus. And then Christine Potter's Dark Waters is just phenomenal. And then Justine Kurland's more recent like collage work is just like seeing how those artists that I sometimes wonder if they have also observed the same thing and realized it's like, how about I just like really flip things around?
I think, yeah, to that point, and kind of like to this point that we're kind of like, talking about and hitting on the head, if I can hit it on the head again, I think, if I think about the great artists and great art throughout history, it's always in service of redefinition and revolution, right? And so, like, I think like anything that we can do to continue to shake things up and to look at things in a different and to provide new ways of looking isn't necessarily always going to create that new best thing, but it's in service of that. It could be the next iteration after that one, right? And so,
Yep.
like, that's, I think, something that I've got my eye focused on.
Yeah, exactly. That exactly like new iterations just took me straight back to grad school. Like that was like my first semester and a half was just iterations, just like just do these things. But yeah, I guess to kind of tie things off, where can people find both you and Disparate Projects?
Yeah, so disparateprojects.com is where you can find information about us. That's our home on the web. You can find your way to the storefront on that, which has a few offerings at the moment. We just released our first trade edition book from the artist Christian Lopez Miro called Fractured, which is basically a look at his navigating his new environments in the American South. So Christian is a enflammic photographer. He takes, I think if I didn't pronounce that incorrectly, he takes photographs of people's eyes at the Duke Eye Clinic.
Oh, yeah.
And he recently relocated, maybe in the last 6 or so years, up to Chapel Hill, North Carolina from Miami. So that book is a response to him trying to find his place in his new environment. And yeah, you could also find our books. Currently, we have a few of my books at indie photo bookstore in Denver, North Carolina. Sorry, Denver, Colorado, excuse me.
Yep.
Denver is not, I don't even think they're in Denver, North Carolina.
There might be.
Maybe. That's called Earnest Paper. And also give a shout out to my collaboration with Benschop Books, Vera Benschop of Denver. She's an amazing artist. And yeah, where else can you find us? I think look out for us. We just did a collaboration. Disparate Projects just did a collaboration with a physical show with the Curated Fridge up in Boston. Keep an eye out for our curation projects. And we've got a few things in the fire in terms of new publishing projects. So we should have some news to share about those probably getting closer to the mid of the year, I'm hoping here.
Yeah.
Check out more of my work at vannthomaspowell.com. I've got most of my projects up there. You can find me on Instagram, Van_T_Powell. Yeah, that's mostly it. If you're in Tennessee, come check out my show, and opens in June. I think it's going to run for 3 months at the Carnegie Center for Art and History in Jackson, Tennessee. That'll be a show of On Contentious Ground, and I believe, unless my travel plans get in the way, depending on what happens with visas and documents and things like that, I should be there speaking about the work as well. Yeah, I think that's about it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a really great conversation, getting to know this work deeper and talk a bit about history as well and all that. So always a good time. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeff. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Ready for Mistakes. This series of interviews is entirely self-produced and self-funded and would not be possible without the generosity of guests' time and willingness to participate. If you would like to support the show, I will not take your money, and instead I ask you to subscribe and follow on our various social media profiles, and of course, to share it with your friends. Do you want to come on the show and discuss your work? Submit to the form in the show notes and put your name in the hat. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one.